The line of men stretched from Eliza's barn door, their shoulders slumped against the biting wind, their hats clutched in frozen hands. They were ranchers, men of substance and pride, now humbled into a silent, miserable queue in the heart of the worst winter in living memory. Inside the small, tight-walled barn, the air was warm with the steam of a great living furnace, and the sound that filled it was a deep, resonant breathing, the slow and powerful rhythm of a life that defied the death gripping the prairie outside. At the head of the line stood Mr. Sterling, the wealthiest of them all, his face a mask of chapped pride and bitter defeat. He had come to bargain for the life of his herd, to plead for the services of the animal he now needed more than anything, the very animal he himself had once thrown away. The irony was as sharp and cold as the air he breathed. He was here to beg for the future from a woman he had pitied, and from a beast he had condemned. 2 years earlier, that sound had been the ragged, shallow gasp of a thing not even worth the bullet to kill it. It was spring, a season of frantic life on the plains. Sterling's cattle drive was a river of dust and hide, flowing north toward the summer ranges. Eliza watched from the porch of her small homestead, a place she'd inherited along with a widow's pension and a crushing sense of solitude. Her land was marginal, a square of earth the railroad had sold cheap because the creek ran thin by August. Sterling's land, by contrast, drank deep from the river and spread over the horizon. He was a man who measured worth in numbers, head of cattle, acres of grass, dollars in the bank. Things that didn't measure up were discarded. That day, a young heifer, barely more than a calf herself, dropped her firstborn in a shallow gully at the edge of Eliza's property. The birthing was hard, and the result was pitiful. The calf was a knot of wet red hair and bones like twigs, too small and weak to stand. It tried, wobbling on impossible legs, before collapsing with a sigh that seemed to know its own fate. Sterling rode over, looked down from his tall horse, and curled his lip in disgust. "A runt," he declared to his foreman. "It'll never make it. Leave it for the coyotes." Nature's way, his herd moved on, a tide of life receding and leaving its single piece of wreckage behind. Eliza watched them go, the dust settling in the still air. She stayed on her porch for a long time, watching the gully where the small, still form lay. Nature's way, Sterling had said. But Eliza knew nature had more than one way, and not all of them were cruel. Eliza lived by a different sort of arithmetic than Sterling. His was the math of massive herds and acceptable losses. Hers was the quiet, desperate calculation of a woman alone. A small pension, a mortgage payment due each autumn, the gnawing need for a milk cow, perhaps an ox to break the stubborn soil she hoped to turn into a garden. The price of a healthy calf at market was more than she could afford. For an hour, she did the sums in her head, weighing the cost of her goat's precious milk against the sliver of a chance that the creature in the gully might live. It was a foolish calculation, one any man in the county would laugh at. But her loneliness was a weight in the equation, too, a silent number that tipped the scales. She took a bucket and an old wool blanket and walked to the gully. The calf was still there, its breathing a faint flutter against its ribs. The coyotes had not yet come. Its mother, a confused and frightened young thing, had been swept along with the herd, her lowing calls fading into the distance. The calf looked up at Eliza with eyes that were vast and dark and held no expectation at all. She knelt, wrapped it in the blanket, and with a grunt of effort, lifted the 50-pound weight of it into her arms. It felt like nothing, a bundle of fragile bones. Carrying it back to the house, she felt the faint, stubborn warmth of its life against her chest. She laid it on a bed of sacks by the hearth and warmed the goat's milk, adding a spoonful of molasses for strength. The calf wouldn't take a bucket. She dipped a clean rag in the warm milk and patiently squeezed the sweet drops into its mouth. It was a slow, painstaking process. For hours she sat there, the sole caretaker of a life the world had already written off. The next day, she had to go to the general store for flour and salt. The news, it seemed, had traveled faster than she had. The usual cluster of men, Jed, Silas, and the storekeeper, Mr. Gable, paused their conversation as she entered. Jed grinned. "Heard you adopted a coyote snack, Eliza." Silas chuckled. "Waste of good milk, I'd say. That thing's got no more chance than a snowball in July." Mr. Sterling was there, leaning against the counter, radiating smug authority. He looked her over with a kind of pity that was worse than scorn. "A woman's heart is a tender thing," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "And often a poor accountant. You can't turn a profit on sentiment. Mrs. Collins," he called it Eliza's folly, and the name stuck. Eliza felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her tongue. Arguing with them was like arguing with the wind. It would change nothing and only leave her breathless. She met mockery with stillness. She gathered her supplies, paid Mr. Gable with her carefully counted coins, and walked out, her back straight. Being right, she thought, was a quiet thing. You didn't need to announce it. If you were right, the proof would come in its own time. If you were wrong, no amount of shouting would change it. She went home to her folly, who was waiting for another meal of warm milk dripped from a rag. The first few nights were a constant vigil. Eliza slept on the floor by the hearth, waking every 2 hours to the calf's weak cries. She fed it, she cleaned it, she massaged its spindly legs, trying to work strength into the weak muscles. The arithmetic was grim. Each feeding was a measurable loss from her own winter stores, a debit against her own survival. But with each sunrise the calf was still breathing, a small, stubborn victory against the odds. A few days into her strange mission, a boy appeared at her fence line. He was Leo, not more than 10, the son of one of Sterling's ranch hands. He was a quiet, watchful child who seemed more comfortable in the company of animals than people. He didn't say anything at first, just stood and watched as Eliza carried the calf out into the small patch of sun in her yard. The next day he was back, and this time he spoke. "Is he going to live?" "I'm trying," Eliza said. The boy nodded, as if this were the most reasonable answer in the world. He came every day after that. He didn't ask permission, he just started helping. He gathered fresh bedding, scrubbed the milk bucket with a fierce concentration, and sat for hours with the calf, stroking its head and whispering to it. It was Leo who finally gave the calf a name. "We should call him Anchor," he said one afternoon, his voice serious. "'Cause he's gonna hold you here, ain't he? Keep you from floating away." Eliza looked at the boy, and at the small animal that was costing her so much, and felt the truth in his words. Her nearest neighbor was Mr. Sorensen, an old Norwegian bachelor who farmed a small, meticulously kept plot of land a mile down the road. He was a man of few words, and the ones he used were heavy with the accent of his homeland and the wisdom of a long life spent watching the earth. One evening, he appeared at her door, holding a small cloth-wrapped bundle. He didn't mock her or pity her. He simply walked past her to the hearth and knelt by the calf, his joints cracking like dry twigs. He ran a gnarled hand over the animal's back, felt the knobs of its spine, the unlikely angle of its hips. He looked at the calf for a long time, his pale blue eyes seeing things Eliza could not. "In my country," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, "we learn that the hard start can make the strong finish. The tree that fights the wind has the deepest roots." He unwrapped the bundle. It was a gnarled, pale root. "Birch root. Dry it, grind it to a powder. A pinch in his milk. It settles the stomach and strengthens the bone." He placed the root in her hand. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked out at the vast, indifferent prairie. "Sometimes," he said, his gaze far away, "the stone the builder refused is the one that holds the whole wall." Eliza didn't fully understand, but she felt the weight of his words. That night, she grated the birch root into a fine powder and stirred a pinch into Anchor's milk. Summer arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the plains to a pale biscuit brown. The mockery from the town had faded, replaced by a kind of settled, pitying narrative. Eliza's folly was no longer a joke, but a quiet testament to her foolish, soft-hearted nature. No one bothered to come and look, assuming the calf, if it was even still alive, was a scrawny, pathetic thing. They were wrong. Anchor was not growing fast, but he was growing right. The birch root, the steady supply of milk, and Eliza's relentless care were working a slow magic. The weakness in his legs vanished, replaced by a solid, grounded stance. His chest, which had been a shallow cage of ribs, began to deepen and broaden. He was not built like Sterling's cattle, which were bred for long legs and height to cover distance. Anchor was built low and wide, a creature designed for power, not for speed. There was a surprising thickness to his bones, a density that hinted at a different kind of strength. Eliza and Leo kept his progress a secret. They moved him from the yard to the small, secluded pasture behind her barn, a patch of green hidden from the road by a stand of cottonwoods. There, they worked with him every day. He had a remarkably calm temperament, his large, intelligent eyes following their every move. He never spooked, never fought. He seemed to possess a placid self-assurance, as if he knew his own worth even if no one else did. Eliza's arithmetic began to change. In the evenings, sitting by the lamplight, she stopped calculating the cost of his survival and started calculating his potential. She found an old almanac with drawings of different cattle breeds. She studied them intently, comparing the pictures to the young bull in her pasture. She recognized his type, an old-line foundation stock, the kind that were disappearing in favor of the ringier, faster-growing breeds Sterling favored. Sterling, in his haste for size and profit, had discarded something of greater, quieter value. The thought settled in her heart like a banked coal, a secret warmth she tended in private. She was no longer just saving a life, she was nurturing a future no one else could see. The town could have its story about Eliza's folly. She and Leo and Mr. Sorensen had a different story, one they watched unfold day by day in the hidden pasture. By the following summer, Anchor was a young bull, and he was a marvel. He wasn't the tallest bull in the county, but he was by far the broadest, a solid block of muscle and bone covered in a coat of rich, dark red. His neck was a thick column of power, his head wide between the eyes, and those eyes remained as calm and intelligent as they had been when he was a calf. He moved with a deliberate, unstoppable grace. With Eliza and Leo, he was as gentle as a dog, nudging their hands for a scratch behind the ears. His dignity was immense, a quiet authority that emanated from him. He was the living embodiment of the strength Mr. Sorensen had spoken of, the deep-rooted tree that had fought the wind. His vindication, when it came, arrived with the squeal of a broken axle. A cattle buyer from Kansas City, a Mr. Davies, was in the territory to inspect Sterling's herd. On his way out of town, the wheel of his wagon shattered on the rutted road right in front of Eliza's property. While his driver went for help, Davies, a man bored and impatient, decided to stretch his legs. He wandered toward Eliza's fence line, more out of idle curiosity than any real interest. And then he saw Anchor. Davies stopped dead. He was a man who had seen thousands of cattle, whose entire life was the appraisal of livestock. He stared at Anchor, his mouth slightly agape. He slowly approached the fence, his professional eye taking in the bull's impossible depth of chest, the straightness of his back, the powerful set of his legs. This was not an animal. This was a blueprint. "Ma'am," he called out to Eliza, who was weeding her garden. "Pardon me, but where on earth did you get that bull?" Eliza walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. She told him the simple truth. He was a runt from Mr. Sterling's herd. He was left behind. Davies let out a low whistle, a sound of pure astonishment. He walked the length of the fence, never taking his eyes off Anchor. "Sterling left this bull?" "Ma'am, that man didn't just throw away a calf. He threw away a fortune. This is old-line Durham stock, the foundation kind. The kind you build a whole herd on. Calm, hardy, prepotent. They don't make them like this anymore." He turned to her, his eyes alight with a businessman's fervor. "I will give you $300, cash, for him right now." It was a staggering sum, enough to pay off her mortgage and secure her for years. The men in town would have called her a fool for even hesitating. But Eliza looked at Anchor, the animal she had saved and nurtured, the creature Leo had named for his steadfastness. She thought of the future she was building. She shook her head. "Thank you, sir, but he is not for sale." Davies looked disappointed but deeply respectful. "I understand," he said. "An animal like that is more than just money." Before he left, his wagon repaired, he tipped his hat. "You have a good eye, ma'am. A better eye than any man in this county, it seems." The story of the Kansas City buyer's offer spread through the town like wildfire, growing with each telling. $300 became $500, then $1,000. The name, Eliza's Folly, was spoken less often, and when it was with a tone of confusion rather than derision. The town's perception, as solid as the sun-baked earth, had begun to crack. What had been an object of ridicule was slowly becoming a source of wonder, and for one man, a source of deep and burning envy. Mr. Sterling heard the rumors, and they soured in his gut. It was one thing for the woman to have saved the runt out of sentiment. It was another thing entirely for her to have stumbled into value. It suggested he had made a mistake, and Sterling was not a man who made mistakes. His judgment was law, his opinion fact. The idea that this quiet widow had seen something he had missed was an intolerable affront to his pride. He decided to see the animal for himself. He rode over to Eliza's farm one afternoon, dismounting at her fence with a practiced, neighborly smile that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze fell on Anchor, and for a moment, his composure slipped. The bull was magnificent, a powerhouse of genetics that he, in his arrogance, had discarded. He quickly masked his shock with a smooth, false warmth. "Well now, Mrs. Collins," he boomed. "I must say, you've done a remarkable thing here. It's astonishing what a woman's gentle care can accomplish." He leaned on the fence, affecting a casual air. "Of course, an animal of that size and temperament. It can be a dangerous thing. A lot for a young woman alone to handle." He let the veiled concern hang in the air. "As the man who, in a manner of speaking, provided the original stock, I feel a certain responsibility. I'd be willing to take him off your hands. For your safety, of course. I'll give you $50 for your trouble." The offer was an insult, a fraction of what Davies had proposed, and they both knew it. It was a test of her nerve, an attempt to reassert his dominance. Eliza did not flinch. She met his condescending gaze with the same stillness she had shown in the general store 2 years before. "He is no trouble, Mr. Sterling. And he is not for sale." Her calm, simple refusal was more infuriating to him than any argument would have been. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew the value of what she held. Sterling's smile tightened. "You might want to reconsider," he said, his voice losing its warmth. "This is a big county. Fences break. Animals stray. It would be a shame if something were to happen to such a fine specimen." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the threat hanging in the dusty air. That evening, Mr. Sorensen stopped by. He said nothing of Sterling, but his eyes scanned the horizon. He sniffed the air. The sky was a hard, cloudless blue, and the air was unnaturally dry. "The winter is coming, Eliza," he said, his voice grim. "The old signs are there. The geese flew south a month early. The squirrels' coats are thick. This one will have teeth." He looked from the sky to her barn, to the neat stack of hay beside it. "I hope you have enough put by," Eliza nodded, but a cold knot of apprehension formed in her stomach. The threat wasn't just from Sterling anymore. It was in the sky itself. The winter came not as a gentle blanket, but as an assault. It began with an early, impossibly deep snow in November, burying the cured autumn grass. Then came the ice, a week-long storm of freezing rain that coated every surface in a thick, glassy shell. The world became a treacherous, glittering prison. After the ice, the temperature plummeted and stayed there, a relentless, soul-crushing cold that seemed determined to extinguish every spark of warmth on the prairie. For most ranchers, it was a catastrophe. Their herds, accustomed to winter grazing, were cut off from their food by the impenetrable ice. Sterling's cattle, bred for size over resilience, began to suffer immediately. They huddled in miserable clusters, their coats rimed with frost, their desperate lowing a constant, mournful sound on the wind. The shallow creeks and wells froze solid, forcing men to spend their days chopping holes in the ice for water, a battle they often lost. But on Eliza's small homestead, there was a quiet order. Her arithmetic had always been one of careful margins and planning for the worst. She had only one large animal to provide for, not 100. Her small barn was sturdy, its walls chinked tight against the wind. Her stack of hay, which had seemed modest, was a mountain of security when measured against the need of a single bull. It was stacked high and dry, protected by a canvas sheet. Her well, dug deep into a natural spring, was the one thing that hadn't frozen. It was the secret gift of her supposedly marginal land. Day after day, she followed her routine. In the pre-dawn chill, she would carry buckets of fresh water to Anchor, his warm breath steaming in the lantern light. She would fork down fragrant hay, and he would eat with a slow, steady contentment. She was living on an island of preparedness in an ocean of desperation. The news from town was grim. Cattle were dying. First the old and the weak, then the calves from the previous spring. Ranchers were spending their savings on hay shipped in by the railroad at ruinous prices, but the supply was dwindling. Men who had built their lives on self-reliance were facing utter ruin. The laughter that had once filled the general store at the mention of Eliza's folly was a distant, bitter memory. Now, there was only the grim, silent accounting of their losses, a tally of frozen carcasses to be dealt with when the thaw finally came. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy confidence, the casual cruelty, and leaves behind the raw, humbling truth of survival. The men who had scorned her were learning a lesson the winter was teaching with brutal efficiency. As the weeks of brutal cold stretched into months, desperation began to erode the hard shell of frontier pride. The first to come to Eliza's door was Jed, one of the men who had laughed the loudest in the general store. He arrived on a raw February morning, his face chapped and gray with worry, his hat twisting in his raw-knuckled hands. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Mrs. Collins," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the ground. I see you still have hay." It was a statement, not a question. Everyone knew she did. Her neat stack was a landmark of survival in a landscape of want. "My last few cows. They ain't gonna make it another week. I was wondering if I could buy a few bales from you." This was the moment Eliza could have claimed her victory. She could have named a price 3 times what the hay was worth, and he would have paid it. She could have reminded him of his words, of his laughter. She could have enjoyed the reversal of their fortunes. Instead, she looked at the exhaustion etched on his face and saw not an enemy, but a neighbor in trouble. "The price is what I paid for it in the fall, Jed," she said quietly. 75 cents a bale. I'm not looking to profit from a hard winter." Jed looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, then with a wave of shame and gratitude so profound it left him speechless. He could only nod, his throat working. He paid her, loaded the bales onto his sled, and left without another word. But his silence was more eloquent than any apology. The story of her fairness spread even faster than the story of the buyer's offer had. A few days later, a delegation appeared at her gate. It was a group of the county's ranchers, their faces grim. Silas was there, and even Mr. Gable from the store. They had come not for hay, but for something far more important. Their herds were decimated. Even the animals that survived would be too weak to breed. Their bulls, in particular, had been hit hard. Many were sick or had already died. Without a calf crop in the spring, they were all finished. It meant total ruin, the end of their ranches and their way of life. Their request was simple and humbling. They needed a bull strong enough and hardy enough to save their bloodlines. They had come to ask for Anchor's services. Standing at the back of the group, his face a thundercloud of resentment, was Mr. Sterling. He had been forced to come along, to swallow his pride and join the procession of beggars to the door of the woman he had ridiculed. He had lost more than half his herd, and his prize bulls were gone. He was ruined, unless she agreed to help. Eliza looked at the faces of the men before her. She remembered every smirk, every condescending word. She held their futures in the palm of her rough, work-worn hand. She could have refused them all. She could have singled out Sterling for ruin, telling him that nature's way was for the weak to perish. She could have demanded fees so exorbitant they would have been indebted to her for a decade. The power she now held was